Today, we're going to hear from Eric Brown, who is an assistant professor of mental health counseling and behavioral medicine at Boston University School of Medicine. Eric has bridged the work of theory and practice by working in both academic and clinical settings, and he routinely presents to schools, adolescent community development organizations, and churches on topics related to trauma and also trauma-informed care. Today, he's going to be presenting to us some research that he's done on religious leaders, specifically focusing on the relationships between adverse childhood experiences, so ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, religious coping, and also social support. So to get things started, I'll just say welcome to Eric. We look forward to your presentation.
Right. Thank you so much, Thad. Something that I don't think I shared with Thad, but I'm going to share with you all. I am a professor. I'm a clinical mental health counselor, but I am also a pastor. I pastored the church for 15 years. Senior pastor for 11 years. Did some other pastoral work. Before all of this, I'm also a PK and a grand PK. So church leaders are my people. I'm going to go really quickly because Chad has this organized very well, and I want to respect all of our time. Okay. I want to move something over just so I can be sure to watch the clock. Okay. I'm sure some of you already know about adverse child experiences, but I'm going to give a 5-minute overview of why we did this study. What I'm hoping to do is two things. I'm hoping really to help you understand some of the factors, right, that may undermine the well-being of church leaders. I'm also hoping that what we're able to do here is provide you some signals, maybe some things to consider when you have other church staff, lay leaders, or congregants who may be struggling with their own well-being. This might give you a glimpse into why that might be. It was in the mid-90s, late 90s, that a public health study came out, and it truly rocked the public health world. Some of you will know about the Adverse Child Experience Study. It was done in California, over 13,000. It was mainly white middle class persons who were, I believe it was the Pfizer Institute. They were really studying events that happened in their backgrounds to see if they had any effect well into their adult years, and they found that it did. They found that childhood adversity affects a myriad, several different both mental health and physical health factors. What the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, they discovered that there are these 10 factors. I'm sure there are more than these 10, but when you talk about the adverse childhood experience study, there's a measurement, and we're going to have you take the measurement yourselves. But these are the 10 factors that they've looked at. And they have 3 different categories: physical abuse, physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. There's a category for neglect and a category for household challenges. What they found in this study is that, obviously there are some people who, if you look at these 10 factors, they didn't have any of these experiences growing up. So their ACEs score would be a 0. Okay. There's a small percentage of people who have had almost all of these factors happen. And they've discovered that ACEs has a dose-by-dose response, or a dose-by-dose effect. So whatever your number is, right, if it's above 0, right, each number that goes up, it truly increases the possibility that you will struggle with or suffer from both physical and or mental health struggles. So just to give you some examples of this, and since the late 90s, there have literally been thousands of studies done on ACEs, and they found that there is a positive correlation, right? There is a strong relationship between these factors and ACEs and more. The cutoff score, it depends on the study, is generally 3 or more. And obviously it depends on what ACEs it is. If I go back to this screen, some of these adverse child experiences have much more detrimental effects than others. But in general, the score is 3 3, maybe 4 or more. Mental health counselors, physicians began to get concerned because the likelihood of you struggling in various ways goes up considerably. Let me just give you a few quick stats. If a person has 4 ACEs or more, right, compared to a person who has none, no adverse childhood experiences, their chances of issues like alcoholism, drug abuse, depression, suicide attempts increases anywhere between 4 and 12-fold. Okay. A person who has 4 ACEs or more compared to a person who has none, they have a 460% increase, a likelihood or increase in suffering from depression. A person who has 4 or more ACEs compared to someone who has none, they have, now catch this number, a 1,220% increase in likelihood of attempting suicide, right? A good friend of mine did a study with ACEs and marriages in heterosexual couples. What she found was that if you're married, your partner's ACEs score affects you, right? And your score affects your partner's as well. What they found was that in heterosexual married couples, the woman's ACEs score affects the man's satisfaction in the marriage, but the man's ACEs score affects the woman's satisfaction with life in general. Okay. They've done studies with ACEs when it comes to college students and work. They've done a lot of studies with ACEs, obviously with youth as well. But they found that your ACEs score actually can predict some struggles in work in terms of how many days you're going to miss work. Persons with higher ACEs scores are actually more likely to be unemployed in middle age. They're also more likely to have conflict with their supervisors and their colleagues. Okay. And so I'll always pause and say this. I've been presenting this information for the past 3 or 4 years, and I can tell that some people are very disturbed by this research. And it occurred to me that this ACEs study is really un-American in 2 ways. We don't want to believe, at least in the US, and I know we have some people who are outside of the US, glad you're here, but we don't want to believe that the past should affect us in the present. We're really resistant to that. And we also don't want to believe that what other people have done, right, or other people's choices should have a significant impact on our lives moving forward. And again, if you look at these adverse child experiences, this is happening to children, right, or teenagers. These are choices that other people, some are choices other people have made. Okay. Let me say one more thing, and then I want to introduce the study real briefly. Before I did the study that I'm going to show you, I did a study with mental health counselors, clinical mental health counselors looking at ACEs and burnout and secondary traumatic stress. And we found that ACEs scores were associated with burnout, but it wasn't as associated with secondary traumatic stress. Okay. So let me just say a few things before I introduce our study real quickly. Please be mindful that ACEs is not destiny. Okay. Some people are concerned, and we're going to have you take the ACEs inventory. Some people are concerned if they have a high ACEs score, then that predicts they will struggle significantly. There are some things that can interrupt, right? There are protective factors that we have that you actually may have even had as a child or a teenager, and we'll talk about those too. We don't want to reduce ourselves nor other persons to their ACEs score. And we do want to protect a person's privacy in terms of what their ACEs score is. Sometimes when I present this information and we have people take the survey, they'll put in the chat window what their ACE score is. I'm not asking anyone to do that. All right. So just real quickly, the demographics of this study, we looked at 102 Black church leaders, and they weren't just clergy, they were church leaders more broadly. They held several different positions. We had about 69% were female, and you see their marital status there. Just real quickly, let me just show you some of the things we looked at. Looked at their ACE score. We looked at secondary traumatic stress and PTSD, but we also wanted to look at their style of religious coping. Okay, Kenneth Pergamon created this assessment, and I call this their intrapersonal theology. Okay, what are you actually telling yourself during hard seasons of life? So we asked them these questions, right? When you've had a hard season in your life, what do you tend to think, right? And if they checked off any of these responses, we call that negative religious coping. I call it negative intrapersonal theology. We also asked about positive religious coping, right? We asked them during these hard seasons of life, do you ever think in these ways? So we wanted to make sure to measure this as well. And again, I know I'm flying by this really quickly. We're going to have hopefully a lot of time at the end if you want to go back. All right. We also asked them about their interactions within congregations. How often do the people in your congregation make too many demands on you? How often are the people in your congregation critical of the things you do? We wanted to get that information, as well as information around religious social support, right? How often do the people in your congregation make you feel loved or cared for? How often do the people in your congregation listen to you, talk about your private problems and concerns, right? We did give a clinical measure for PTSD, and I'm defining it this way. When we look at PTSD, we're talking about hypervigilance. Do you experience hyperarousal? Do you find yourself avoiding certain thoughts, situations? And then there's some items there about flashbacks. Do you have visual or emotional flashbacks? So we had one measurement that looked at PTSD, then another measurement that looked at secondary traumatic stress, just asking questions. Do you experience any of these as a result of what you're hearing from your congregants? Right? And so we're going to take a few minutes and we're going to ask you to take the ACEs in the benevolent childhood measure, okay? And I'm going to walk you through that. The ACEs measure are those 10 items that we looked at about 10 years ago. The, let me put one moment. The CDC came up with 10 positive things that may have happened between birth and 18 as well, right? Between your being born and 18 years of age. And what they found was that if you had a number of these benevolent child experiences, they tended to serve as protective factors, right? So I believe Thad, he put the ACEs up.
That's right. Yeah, so for those of you who have joined us regularly, you know this would be the time where we typically send you out into breakouts. We're not going to do that today at this moment. Instead, what we thought would be helpful is just for you to take just a few moments. If you'll click the link in the chat, that's going to take you to a PDF document where you can just go through the BCE measurement kind of inventory. We'd like to give you just 4 minutes or so to just kind of do some self-assessment to kind of really get in tune with this concept of ACEs, and then we'll come back together.
All right, so before I jump into our results, just wanted to show you there was a study that came out really just a few months before ours did, and they looked at ACEs in seminarians. They didn't look at burnout or secondary traumatic stress. They just wanted to compare the ACEs of seminarians and a national sample, a matching sample. And I wanted to show you this in part because my results are looking more so at Black church leaders, but I wanted you to see a sample of at least seminarians who were majority white. What they found in the seminarians was that the average ACEs score was 1.8, which was actually the same as the national sample. What they found in these seminarians was that seminarians compared to the national sample, they endorsed higher levels of emotional abuse. They were more likely to endorse living with someone with a mental illness and sexual abuse. Okay. Our study, the average ACEs of the Black church leaders was 2.27 ACEs, where the national sample was 1.93. The average BCE score was 9.30, so they were really high benevolent child experiences scores. And I'm actually cheating you a little bit. This is something we can talk about here in a few minutes. But if you look at the benevolent child experiences survey, if I remember correctly, about 3/4 of those you can get if you grew up an active member of the church. Okay, so it really gets at how church can be very much a protective factor for some persons, for some youth. Some of the most common ACEs that people checked off on was divorce or separation of parents, living with someone with an addiction, or living with someone who was either depressed or had another mental illness or attempted suicide. Okay. Just some other stats. We found that 30.9% of our participants checked off on 3 or more ACEs. 52% had moderate to severe secondary traumatic stress, right, which is a really high percentage. About a quarter endorsed at least one symptom of PTSD, which is also high, and 28% had moderate to severe anxiety symptoms. And we did this survey, it was 2 years ago, it was 2022. And just keep in mind that COVID and the racial unrest, it may have affected the Black community harder. We know it did in terms of deaths and some of the financial impacts in the Black community. There were 3 predictors of PTSD. I'm sorry, I shouldn't put in clergy. You should have put in church leaders. One is their ACEs score, right? So having higher ACEs scores predicted PTSD. That negative religious coping, or remember I said that intrapersonal theology. I don't guess this is what church leaders were preaching or teaching in Sunday school, right? But when they were going through hard times, they were doubting whether or not God was there for them. They were wondering if God was punishing them, right, for their sins. And also the relationship with the congregation predicted PTSD in these church leaders. We found that there was a negative religious interactions, right, with congregants. There's a relationship between that and secondary traumatic stress. That's not a surprise. That negative religious coping, right, that negative intrapersonal theology is associated with greater PTSD symptoms. That negative religious coping was associated with negative religious interactions, and we don't know the direction of that relationship. My assumption is it's bi-directional, that the negative intrapersonal theology, right, is probably influencing the way they're interacting with their congregation, and obviously vice versa. And that secondary traumatic stress was associated with negative religious interactions, anxiety, depression, and PTSD. All right. So I'm going to move through. We have about 4 more slides pretty quickly. What we learned is that relationships matter tremendously. Those who felt emotionally supported by their congregation were less likely to suffer from PTSD symptoms, despite their ACEs score, even when they suffered from negative religious coping. I'll read that again. Those who felt emotionally supported by their congregation were less likely to suffer from PTSD, despite even if they had higher ACEs scores, right? Again, a bidirectional relationship between the health of the leader and the support of the church. Negative religious coping and emotional support from the congregation affects the relationship between ACEs and PTSD. At higher levels of negative religious coping, that negative intrapersonal theology, higher emotional support from the congregation appeared to reduce the strength of the negative effects of ACEs on PTSD symptoms. As positive religious coping, remember we measured, for that as well. Positive religious coping is during hard times, you are actually able to believe that God is there, even if you don't feel it in the moment. As positive religious coping scores increased, it had the potential to compensate for the lack of emotional support from the congregants in terms of the conditional effect of ACEs on PTSD. Again, the interpersonal theology matters. Negative religious coping moderates, right? It affects, it influences the relationship between a person's ACEs score and whether or not they're going to suffer from PTSD symptoms. And I thought you might be interested in some of the negative interpersonal theology items that people were more likely to endorse, right? So these were some of the thoughts that they were having when these church leaders were going through hard times. Leaders who engage in positive religious coping tend to suffer less from PTSD symptoms, even if they have higher ACEs numbers. And practicing positive religious coping was so significant, it potentially could compensate for the lack of emotional support from the congregation. Just this, and I think one more slide. What do leaders need to know? That if they've suffered significant childhood adversity and are serving a congregation that is not emotionally supportive or even hostile, they may be more likely to suffer from PTSD symptoms. Okay. And that there's a relationship between negative religious coping and negative religious interactions with the congregants. Negative religious coping might contribute to a leader's relational style, which may affect the congregation's emotional support of them. So the last slide here is this. What can we do? Right? We can encourage our church leaders to try to increase positive religious coping during hard times. And just one example is really engaging in contemplative practices, right? Second thing is recognize the potential relationships between religious coping and negative religious interactions with congregants, right? I saw this during my years as a pastor. I saw this growing up with certain church leaders, and I've certainly seen this in my counseling office, my clinical office, when I'm working with church leaders, and they have these struggles, these intense struggles with different church members, right? Sometimes it's obvious, it's the church. And we all know sometimes it is the leader, her or himself. And leaders need to be in communities of support, okay? That leaders very much need to be with others who they can share their experiences with. Let me get out of this, and then we can I'll turn it back over to you. That.
Great. All right. So I'm going to send you back out into your breakout rooms, and we want you just to spend a few minutes talking about what you've heard thus far. And in particular, the question that we're going to pose to you is what stood out? So what has stood out to you thus far in the presentation? And also, I want to just kind of put a note that we will have time for Q&A in just a few minutes. And so please begin thinking, formulate those questions so that we can have a robust dialogue with Eric after you get back. So again, the question, what has stood out to you thus far? We are going to now turn to a time of Q&A. So I hope that you've had a chance to kind of percolate a few questions. Feel free to go ahead and drop those in the chat or use the raise hand function, however you'd like. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. I'm going to start off with a few for Eric, just to get us started and see kind of where the conversation goes from there. But we really do want to hear from you all as well. So feel free to drop the questions you've got in the chat. So Eric, let me start with this. Many of the folks that are on this call know that one of my former colleagues and I did a national study to look at the support network that was available to religious leaders in North America. And one of the things that we found in the data is that the single greatest kind of data point that was really explaining everything else was the fact that 70% of those that we surveyed who support religious leaders were former religious leaders themselves. So in other words, those that are supporting the arms of Moses, Aaron and Hur, if you will, they used to be in Moses's position. So they used to be pastors themselves. And so I'd just be curious if you can kind of reflect upon that, because one of the things that stood out to me, both in the quantitative work that we did, as well as the qualitative interviews, was that oftentimes it was negative experiences, especially within the church, that were driving folks into professions to care for religious leaders. So talk to us a little bit about that. What reflections do you have, especially for our group that's many of them composed of former religious professionals themselves? So like help us to grapple with that in light of your findings.
Yeah, that's rich, and that is an all too common story that many of us have experienced. The name Edwin Friedman, I don't know if that rings a bell. It kind of shows your age if you know who Friedman is. Back in the day in seminaries, they could have us read Friedman. He was a Jewish rabbi, but he was also a marriage and family therapist, and he spoke to a lot of church leaders about issues, struggles with congregants. And one of the questions he would ask is, which one of your ancestors ordained you? Okay. Which one, and when he says ancestors, he's not talking about people who necessarily were dead. They might have died, but usually a lot of times we get into the profession to begin with, right? Because of the roles that we played within our family system. Okay. And that ends up becoming kind of a part of our calling, what's driving us. And so when we enter into these callings, like I did, and you start having some really negative interactions, it can be doubly painful. Okay. Really, really painful. I've experienced that. I've seen that in my family, and I've certainly seen that in my clinical office. That the struggle is for those of us who said, okay, I'm not going to be in that pastoral role, but I'm going to help others. The reality is you're still holding a lot that you cannot share, particularly when you know the struggles of specific church leaders. And so what I'm saying is all the more we need to create communities of support for those who are actually caring for church leaders. Yeah. Is that getting at your question?
Yeah, so it certainly is, and I think in some ways it speaks to the importance of this gathering for the folks that are on this call, right? So you all need support, right? We hope that this is a community upon which you can kind of rely, not just for the things in your head, but also the things in your heart as well. So thanks so much for that, Eric. And I think it actually is a great segue. So Jim put in the chat, and I'll again invite anybody that does have a question to put anything in the chat, but. So the question is there any data on how many of these church leaders are in some kind of support group?
Yeah, that's a great question. We got this church data, and I should have said this, from a program, all right, that we started in a southern state. So all of this data was coming from one particular state. And when we were interviewing people, church leaders, to be a part of this program, we asked them, were they in communities of support? And most of them were not outside of their congregations. I'll also make another note, which goes to the first question. I've been helping with a project here at Boston University at the Danielson Institute. It's a clinical mental health counseling outward facing. Some of you may know Steve Sandage. I believe he's been on this phone call. And they got a lot of money from the Peel Foundation to create these groups, particularly for clergy, for therapists, and for chaplains, right? So they created these groups nationally, right, as over Zoom for clergy, chaplains, and therapists. In their recruitment, because this is a study, out of those three groups, which group do you think they had the hardest time getting participants for? It was the clergy, okay? We've been doing this study now for 2 years, I believe. So we have some results. Out of those three groups, which group do you think benefited the most, right? It was the clergy. All right. So it's hard for us to get into these groups, but we actually do benefit the most. I'll say a couple of things. One struggle that people have is this is, I think, what's so neat about this Danielson group is that these are groups made up of clergy all across the country, right? They're not clinical groups, so we can do them over Zoom. And so you don't have to worry about being in the same diocese, right, as another participant. There are a lot of reasons why people don't want to create communities within actually the denominational networks that they're in. So,
yeah, that's great. Well, and I know many of you who are on the call today were with us earlier this year when Steve Sandage spoke to us about that study that they're doing, and also the intervention that kind of goes alongside it. So in the chat, I have put a link to that particular presentation. They've also got a kind of an open call right now going because, as Eric mentioned, it is hard to get clergy to get involved in these type of groups. So I need to find that link, and I'll try to do that before our time ends. But I also wanted just to put in the chat another link, and this link will take you to a Google Drive folder where the assessments that we used today, the BCE as well as the ACE, are found. And that actually leads me to the next question that I want to engage with you, Eric, on, and that is, we've got some people that are practitioners here on the call. They work with clergy on a regular basis. And so can you give us some guidance about how to either use or be careful to refer in these kind of settings? Because we're really dealing with some very sensitive topics, and so we can sometimes do more harm than good if we're using things, that we're not fully trained on. So can you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I can. And right before I get in that, there was one question by Anastasia about the 1.8. And I probably shouldn't have put that on the slide. That's research speak, right? Basically, what it's saying is that the average score for the seminarians was close to 2, right? But what that meant is that you had some who had none, and you had some who had more than 2, right? Could have even had 4. Going back to Thad, your question. I mean, it's important to have a list of resources, and I believe most of the people on this call they do have a list of resources. Talking about therapy resources, but something, and I love Chris Adams. I believe Chris Adams has been on this call. I was with Chris just a few weeks ago, and what Chris is doing out in California, and again, this is national, right? Anyone across the nation can be a part of this. They set up these coaching groups, okay? And what they found is, knowing us, right, knowing clergy, that we are much more likely to feel comfortable joining a coaching group, right, than going to therapy, right? And so maybe that's something. And I'm not saying just find a coach out there, but I'm saying specifically look at what Chris Adams is doing out in California. What we did, going back to the previous question, we took a lot of the church leaders, right? Not all 102, but we offered it to all the church leaders in that state in the South. We offered to put them in groups, right? These coaching groups. And we actually got really good positive results from doing so. And what's happening in these groups is that these groups is not just about executive coaching, right? They're also building relationships with other church leaders, and they're processing what's needed. Now, to go back to your other question, Thad, these are sensitive topics, right? I would not give someone the ACEs inventory, ask them to do it, and let me know what their score is. Okay, I don't need that, right? I need it as a clinician. But if I'm just working with church leaders, I don't ask them to tell me that, right? I will let them know maybe about the ACEs. And then you can say, listen, if you find out you have a high score, this could explain some of the struggles you're having, and then provide them some of these options, whether it's if you have a therapist, right? Or maybe the Danielson Institute, those groups, they've actually analyzed the first round of those. I led the first 2 groups that they had, and they're getting really good results from that as well. So just know that the resources are out there.
Yeah, and to refer, right?
Yeah.
Like I think that's the kind of big takeaway. That bringing awareness is a great thing, but then in terms of actually treating, we want to make sure that we're we've got the clinical background needed and training, the credentials to be able to actually get people to a better spot. All right, so Eric, you mentioned that your study isn't just about clergy, but also church leaders, laity as well. So how can a pastor help their congregation kind of deal with some of this. And then I guess I wonder, like, is that kind of a backdoor approach to get the clergy person actually aware and interested in these topics as well?
Yeah, I was telling Thad that I'm working on two. These aren't my grants, but I'm on the leadership team of two different Lilly funded grants, where we're working, helping churches understand trauma. And what we learned was that when we help church leaders understand how to minister in a trauma informed way with their congregants, a lot of them are understanding their own lives, right? They're understanding their own vulnerabilities. And that is important. Chris Adams, again, told us that what research continues to show is that the number one predictor of a senior pastor's well-being and longevity in a church is their relationship with their staff and lay leaders. Okay. And I was a senior pastor for 11 years. I can say amen to that. Okay. So one thing that church leaders can do what some church leaders are doing, they are creating panel discussions in their congregations, right, about mental health struggles. They're inviting in speakers. Most churches have mental health professionals within the church, and they're inviting them to do presentations. Other things that what we found with our church leaders in both projects, just as a result of being a part of our program, they are judiciously, right? They're not just sharing, as we would say in the South, all of their business, right? But they are sharing more in narrative form, in their own churches about either struggles that they have or experiences with mental health struggles, just to begin to open up the conversation. Both in seminary, well, actually, primarily when I was in seminary, and this was before I became a mental health professional, the person who headed up our ministry program was a licensed professional counselor. And he stressed the need for church leaders to have some counselors that you trust, that you can collaborate with, right? We don't have to tell our congregants to just go and see a therapist. We can continue to see them, right? But they can do both. And there are some calls even within, I know, the American Psychological Association, as well as the American Counseling Association, for therapists to partner up with religious leaders as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Let me get to a couple of the questions we've got in the chat. And if I'll just be cognizant of the time here, because I know that some people might need to hop off. And if you do, we thank you so much for being with us. But if you do have a chance to just stick around for us to answer a couple more questions and engage in some further dialogue, we welcome you to stick around as well. So if you need to leave, we understand, but if you're able to stick around, we'd love to have you. So Kevin Kennedy says that the research presented makes a strong argument for the importance of congregational support, some of the stuff we were just talking about. In addition to sharing this information with the congregation, how can a pastor encourage healthy support from congregants? And I'm wondering, Eric, just to build upon Kevin's question, I mean, beyond just the empirical research, I'm wondering if you can kind of pull from your own experience, either about what you did when you were serving in local church ministry, what you observed from your family members, or what you would have hoped would have been the case.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And let me start out with a brief confession. I didn't even think that measurement should be in the study. Okay. That it was my friend and colleague David Wang who put that in there. And this shows you some of my traditional thinking. I'm like, it's not about them serving us, right? It's about, us serving them. But it matters. And to answer your question, Thad, when I look back on my ministry, the people who actually served me best, the congregants that served me best, were people who had either been pastors themselves or they were PKs, right? They were either PKs or they had been pastors themselves. Those were the ones, and even with them, I didn't want to share too much, right? Because you don't want to mess up their church experience. But I could share more about my own life. And I had a few people, you don't need maybe two or three to be able to do that with. It is a delicate balance, in terms of how do you find some measure of support within your congregation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Jim had a comment. This also makes the case for trained, qualified, and experienced interim pastors who can prepare a congregation for an incoming pastor. Many local church leaders have little to no understanding of how to relate and respond to a new pastor. So true. And Becky says, it breaks my heart that clergy or anyone find it difficult for safety and confidentiality within the group, specifically providing support to clergy. How sad.
Yeah. Yeah, we used an interim pastor when I stepped down from my church. I had been there 11 years, and actually I left under great terms. It wasn't a crash and burn. But they had fired the 4 previous senior pastors before me. Okay. So I step in and I'm there 11 years, and I was so drained. They loved me well, but there were obviously some serious issues there, right? But I was so drained at the end of 11 years, I begged the elder board to not hire somebody directly after me. So we hired an interim person who came in for a year, and they were wonderful for the church. And the person they hired after me, I believe, had a better experience as a result.
Yeah. So Michelle says, my experience is that a lot of congregation members are more impatient, cranky, demanding, and even downright mean since COVID. Does this resonate with anyone else? So thanks for sharing. Safe space here. One of the things that I'd point you to, Michelle, is some of the work that's coming out of the Hartford International University Institute's EPIC study. So that Scott Thumma is doing. He received a very generous Lilly grant to study the impact that COVID has had on congregations and also their leaders. If you go to the EPIC website, which is covidreligionresearch.org, I believe, but Google it just to be sure. They've got a ton of resources on everything from mental health to finances to all kinds of things, basically to assess how's the church doing. So I'd love to point you in that direction. And then just a couple of others here quickly. So Anastasia is asking, could community care from non-professionals be a potential solution? So Eric, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. I do believe. I mean, the main thing is healing relationships, right? If we can provide relationships, and there are other people who are not mental health professionals, but they can provide that. Yeah.
Mm. And then also, Eric, I see that you've already thumbs up Karen's comment. So I find many of the symptoms of trauma we see in clergy are seen in the collective behavior of the congregation. Wow, such a strong statement there, which is not addressed when the clergy person leaves and we pass it on to the next clergy person. So talk about that, the kind of generational curses that happen.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think we overestimate sometimes what a clergy person can do, right? This idea that it doesn't matter, what the emotional maturity or makeup of the congregation is. A healthy clergy person should be able to come in and just turn everything around, right? It's just not true, right? I know Jesus is the head, right? The church is the body, so forgive this analogy, right? But if I can use the head as leadership, all right, just as my physical head, we know now, is really affected by my body. It's not just that my head influences my body, but what's going on in my body also influences my head. We know that that's true for church leaders, as well. And so, as we say in clinical practice, hurt people, right? And churches that are already hurting can hurt church leaders. Obviously, church leaders who are hurting can hurt congregants as well. So there's a bi-directional relationship.
Yeah. And maybe a great closing word for this portion of our time together is just what Eric said, is that ACEs are not determinative of the future. It's not, somehow that these are correlations, but there are things that can either mitigate, protect against, or move the needle in the other direction. And what I heard you say loud and clear, Eric, is that support groups, so having peer group kind of relationships are really important, as well as positive coping mechanisms and skills that we in the church oftentimes refer to as spiritual practices.
Sure.
So I would encourage all of you who are here on this call to really think about how and in what ways, not only so who's around you, but what are those spiritual disciplines that you can engage or help others engage, which then help to move the needle. So wonderful. All right. Well, thank you so much, Eric, for being with us today.